Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith looks at the big market rally in soybeans. Loren Giesler discusses soybean seedling diseases. Dan Lloyd describes how Distillers Grains are changing, and Brad Lubben talks about ag appropriations. Roy Smith is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. To put it mildly, good things happened to those commodities on Tuesday and Wednesday. The May soybean contract added more than 30 cents a bushel Tuesday and closed up more than 20 cents in Wednesday's encore. The USDA's latest crop progress report shows the country's farmers have put 13% of this year's corn in the ground, 5 points ahead of the nation's 5-year average. Nebraska's growers planted 7% of their corn in the latest stretch and are now 4 points in front of the state's normal pace. We talked with Roy Wednesday afternoon about what this week's rally means for selling strategies, but we started by asking for an update on planting progress in his area of southeast Nebraska.
Well, here in Cass County, most people have got a little bit of planting done. At least 1 or 2 people have quite a few acres in, but it's going pretty well, just really kind of getting started.
We've seen some positive news over the last 2 days in corn and soybean markets. Diagnose for me what's happening.
Well, first of all, my principle that I try to teach people in the marketing workshops is always sell some corn the 1st of May. Well, here we are sneaking up on the 1st of May. It's a little early, but in fact, I sold some of my old crop corn just because it needs to be sold before planting starts, and so we've got that done. We've had some excitement in Brazil with them trying to impeach the president. That maybe has had some indirect effect because of the value of their currency, which would be affected by the possibility of the president being gone. And there's talk Chinese are in there buying again, and of course we like to see that. That's really good, solid business for developing demand.
Let's talk about corn first. You said you usually sell around, or the strategy is to always sell corn around May 1st. So was this a little earlier than you would have preferred to sell?
Well, it was a little earlier. I guess, you know, those rules that I have like that, it's nice if they hit exactly on the day, but that doesn't happen very often. And the fact that it was about 10 days early, that just says I got it done and I don't have to worry about it anymore. And the same thing with doing any new crop forward pricing. The chart says 1st of May, but if you want to do it on the 20th of April or the 8th of May or whatever, you know, that's within the parameters of what we normally would be looking for, and it came right on time this year.
Would the same hold for soybeans?
Same holds for soybeans. I actually have a date, the 16th trading day of April is the peak day for soybean pricing, and yeah, it doesn't very often hit exactly that day, but that's the target date to get something done. If you want a forward price, that's when you shoot for that time to do it.
If you have any old crop left, do you think this is the time to get rid of it?
Absolutely. and I don't think there's very many bushels of old crop left. Yeah, it's hard to judge that. You don't know what's in these bins that belong to somebody else. But people got impatient in the wintertime and wanted to sell, and wanted to sell a little sooner than what the seasonal trends say. But this market today, it's going to reward you if you procrastinated just a little bit, because we've gone up 20 or 30 cents here in just a very short period of time. And I'll say in the next few days, it will be time to make some sales.
What are the risks out there right now that could impact the market?
Well, we always have the old standby risk, not getting the planting done, not getting it done on time, or a poor stand, or cutworms. There's just a lot of things out there that are risks, but very rarely do they affect the actual number of acres that get planted.
What are you looking at in basis, and how could that move here as we start to get further into the planting season?
Well, if we get some nice warm weather now and people really get going in the field, we're apt to see a basis improve a little bit. I would certainly hope so, because it's been sitting right where it's at all winter and all spring, and we really need to see that basis improve, but it hasn't happened so far.
Seasonally, what would you expect out of prices as we move from spring into summer?
Well, if you look at the long-term charts, you see starting about the 15th of May, the market starts to slip away. The price starts to slip away, I should say, as people are less concerned once the crop is planted. It's not going to yield anything if it doesn't get planted, but once it gets planted, then it has the potential to have some yield, and which is what we need, of course. But it's just gradually eroding away until we get to some place in the middle of summer where there's concern, dry weather, wet weather, whatever. And then there's a chance for a weather rally, was what I call it.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. Nebraska led the nation in commercial red meat production for 2015. This state recorded an output of nearly 7.5 billion pounds, up about 3% from 2014. Overall, the U.S. produced about 2% more meat than a year earlier, including a record output of pork. The USDA says Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Texas together accounted for nearly 49% of the country's total red meat production. In our previous episode of Market Journal, we discussed corn seedling diseases with Nebraska Extension's Tamara Jackson-Zims. This week we'll look at soybeans. The USDA will give its first update on soybean planting progress in Monday's release. As a look ahead to problems growers might notice when plants emerge, we recently talked with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Loren Giesler to discuss disease issues.
We're starting to see that when they start to emerge, there's a few common seedling disease problems that we see. And each year in Nebraska, we'll see your pythiums, phytophthora, rhizoctonia, fusarium. The most common when we got a lot of rain is going to be our pythiums and phytophthora. So if that seed's going in the ground and then the next week you get a lot of rain, that's where you're going to want to look for those. Those are our water molds that we talk about. So, your fine textured soils, your fields with any history of phytophthora stand issues, that's where I expect to see that. Now, with warmer soil temperatures, you tend to see more phytophthora activity, but you can see pythium cool to warm. So that's the first one I'd look out for anywhere we've got areas with rain after seeding or wet conditions. The other one then that we look at, we'll tend to see some rhizoctonia and fusarium, and of those two I'd say rhizoc. So we're still a little bit early for rhizoctonia, but as it continues to warm up and we start seeing planting going into our sandier areas in the state particularly, that's where we tend to see some rhizoctonia develop. And with all of those, these are all things that seed treatments will significantly help. If we have anybody that's used a seed treatment and they're having a stand problem, we're still early to see this, but a week from now, 2 weeks when that's coming up, we start seeing significant stand problems if they use the seed treatment. It's a good indication that they may be dealing with phytophthora if they're in those wetter areas.
Walk me through the scouting process when the soybeans start to pop up, some things that might show or indicate signs of problems.
Well, one thing that's a good clue is looking at cotyledons on that young plant. So when that When that plant emerges and those cotyledons come out, that's that food source that's going on and really feeding that plant initially, and it's kind of its first photosynthetic machine that's working. When you start to see plants where those are yellowing or dropping off, that's a good indication that that seedling's going down. In fact, that's what I do when I'm scouting a field, is I'll go through the field, look for any plants that are dropping cotyledons, and then you can dig those plants up, and many times you can find a little bit of root rot or something going on. The other thing is you may see just areas devoid of any plant, and you know, then you're dealing with, you know, an emergence, pre-emergence damping off. With it, if conditions are right, that can happen many times. So really from early on, from just that seed originally starting to germinate, you know, until it's out of the ground, until we get probably about to the 3-4 leaf stage, you know, we're susceptible to those seedling diseases and those early season problems.
If you're in a replant situation, is that a situation where you would use seed treatments or start to think about operating any differently than you did the first time?
Well, there's two things there. So, you know, if it's a replant because of a stand problem, that was because we were in cooler soil temperatures and we're dealing with pythiums and things that are more problems when we've got some stress, rhizoctonia even. Then sometimes you can get away with just, you know, if soil temperatures are warm by the time you replant, let's go ahead and just put it in the ground, it's going to be fine. The one that I see that can be a significant problem is when you're dealing with Phytophthora, though. Because with Phytophthora, you got a lot of plants maybe that were killed, you got a lot of inoculum, or you got a lot of the fungus present, right? So you go and you plant right down that row again, you're really setting that up for potential failure. So you really want to make sure, if you're dealing with Phytophthora, I would sure use a seed treatment all the time. But if you're dealing with some of those others, soil temperatures warm up, I'm not as worried about using a seed treatment.
How important is it to document these problems for future seasons?
It's critical. I mean, it's critical because any of these, you know, you're looking at really prescriptions for each of these. And also, as we go forward with the technologies that are developing, it is becoming more and more critical. Even zones in the field are going to become managed with these problems, yes and no. So documentation, correct identification, you know, as these plants are coming up and you have problems, if a person's not certain of the identification of the problem, make sure they're using that plant and pest diagnostic clinic that's at the Lincoln campus. You know, they can easily send those in and get a diagnosis, at least of what they can find in the sample.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to more information about Phytophthora root and stem rot. The April Nebraska farmer says agriculture is going through what Ohio State University's Scott Shear refers to as its fourth agricultural revolution. Shear, a professor and chair at Ohio State's Department of Food, Agriculture, and Biological Engineering, says agriculture is now becoming automated. Researchers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln worked together with Shear during his time at the University of Kentucky to learn more about autonomous machines. You can read more about what autonomous ag might look like in the April Nebraska Farmer. In Washington, D.C., the House Appropriations Committee this week approved its ag appropriations bill for the 2017 fiscal year. The bill is $451 million lower than the previous year's and $281 million below President Obama's request. To discuss its contents and learn more about what's next, we talked with Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben Thursday morning.
Well, appropriations is the annual process. Even though a farm bill may have authorized programs through 2018, you still have annual appropriations for those discretionary programs that take money each year to actually run.
What were some of the topics that were the focus this week
Right.
in D.C.?
We knew and expected this is a House ag appropriations bill moving forward, so it covers the ag programs, the Food and Drug Administration, and particularly the implementation of the new food safety rules, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. So sort of three agencies that see a funding discussion here. And we knew that there would be more funding for food safety implementation. There's some funding in there for CFTC and its implementation of some new rules as well. But typically it's been a battle over fewer dollars, sort of in keeping with the budget guidelines and the recommendations or the proposals to reduce spending.
And that was the case again this year, yes?
There's always a fight over funding, and that's the case again this year. There are some things that move forward automatically and spend dollars according to what they're authorized. We call those mandatory programs. They spend mandatory money to implement them as they're written. Then there are things called discretionary programs, which are authorized but subject to funding year in and year out. The Appropriations Committee has authority over discretionary programs. They also effectively exert authority over some of the mandatory programs because they'll add riders that reduce the authority to implement a program, or they will reduce the funding for salaries that are necessary to staff the implementation of a program, all to reduce spending or to save money to spend elsewhere. So there's always a fight in DC.
And of course, if you talk about farm spending, crop insurance always comes to the front, or at least it has over the past few months, towards the end of last year and into this year. What's the latest on that?
Well, you're right. As an example, crop insurance is one of those programs that authorized theoretically doesn't show up in appropriations, except there's always a fight over money. And last year there was a fight over funding, a substantial fight over funding that sort of disappeared within 48 hours because of a substantial response from the crop insurance in the agriculture sector. That lesson apparently learned. There's no fight at this point in the House Appropriations version of the funding. Recognize that we're still a long ways from the finish line. There's a Senate version to come. There's a battle over whether this will ever be heard in its own right or whether it gets wrapped up in a bigger omnibus bill that combines all agencies into one. And in fact, that might not even get heard until some lame duck session after the election.
Is conservation again a target?
Conservation is a target as well. Crop insurance is a target because it became big dollars. Conservation is always a target because there's authority to run programs with mandatory dollars, and until they're spent, those dollars look like a bank account that might be used for other things, and conservation almost continually gets robbed year in and year out to help pay for other programs. The working lands programs like EQIP and CSP will suffer a bit again if those projections come to pass.
As you mentioned, this is the House version. Does the Senate version, would you expect that we'll see the same kind of topics discussed?
Perhaps we'll see the same kind of discussion, but there are clearly some decisions and some riders moving forward in the House version that may not survive or may not face the same support in the Senate. So things like a rider to prevent implementation of GIPSA, Grain Inspection, Packers and Stockyards Administration, GIPSA rules on poultry contracting, a rider to provide funding for FDA education on genetically modified technology and the science of it. Those riders may fit now, they may or may not survive the overall fight.
Next week, Nebraska Extension Ag and Water Law Specialist Dave Aiken will join us to recap the Nebraska unicameral's recently ended session. If you attended one of the 2016 Beef Feedlot Roundtables earlier this year, you heard Iowa State University's Dan Loy explain how the content of Distillers Grains is changing. Iowa and Nebraska are the two largest producers of ethanol in the country, and research shows it can also benefit the livestock industry. A 2014 study from the University of Nebraska described how Nebraska's cattle industry maintained an economic advantage over other states due to the ready access to distillers grains, a byproduct of ethanol production. We talked with Dan earlier this week to learn more about their background and use in the cattle feeding sector.
Well, distillers grains traditionally have been a very important factor, since the ethanol era in about 2005, 2007 or so. In terms of what's happened in terms of inclusion of distillers grains in Iowa and Nebraska, they've become a very valuable resource in terms of competitiveness in lowering their costs and in improving the regional competitiveness of cattle feeding in the upper Midwest.
How is the content of distillers grains changing?
Well, this important value that distillers grains have played over the past few years is changing. We're seeing that distillers grains the ethanol industry is becoming much more efficient in terms of extracting value out of distillers grains, in terms of capturing more of the nutrients that may be there for other purposes. For example, the oil content has reduced over the past 4 or 5 years from about 10 to 11% typically to around 7 to 8%. So we've seen about a 3% reduction in the oil content of distillers grains. And we feel like that's part of the reason why distillers grains have, based on a lot of research, had more energy and more value in terms of feeding value than corn grain has.
How important is that, Dan? What does it mean for the diet and rationing in the feedlot?
Well, it changes the nutrient value and it changes the economic value. You know, historically distillers grains have been shown to have, depending on the inclusion level, especially wet distillers grains, as much as 130 to 130 or 40% of the energy value of corn grain. With each 1% reduction in oil content, we find that that changes that feeding value by about 1.6%. So when we go from that 10 to 12% oil content to something that's closer to 7.5 or 8%, we would expect at the same level of inclusion to see about a 5% reduction in feeding value. The good news is that even at those reduced levels, wet distillers grains, modified distillers grains, which have become the predominant type of distillers grains fed in Iowa and Nebraska, even at that level, it still has more energy than corn grain, which is the base energy feed that we feed to beef cattle in the feedlot.
Does that mean the producer doesn't need to change the diet that much, or are there still alterations that need to happen?
Well, the question relative to making alterations really depends on economics. As I mentioned, it's often priced relative to corn grain, and you know, we've become accustomed over the past 5 to 7 years of distillers grains pricing somewhere between 60 to 90% of corn grain on a dry matter basis. So we have an economic cost of 70 to 90% historically of corn grain and a feeding value of 120 to 130% of corn grain. So the incentive, both from an economic and a nutritional standpoint, has been to feed just as much as we can until we start seeing problems. So inclusions of 30 to 35% were very typical. Today, as that price differential has narrowed, and because of the reduced energy value, we're now seeing inclusions that might be more typical in the range of 20 to 25%. And it's very localized as well, depending on how close you are to an ethanol plant, depending on the specific plant that you're dealing with and your local corn basis. We see a broad range of inclusions that are right for each cattle feeder. So it's something that each cattle feeder needs to work very closely with their nutritionists based on the nutritional value of the feed product that they're dealing with, and also the economics of the alternative feeds that they're dealing with as well.
On the Market Journal YouTube channel or through the Market Journal mobile app, you can view our full interview with Dan. It includes an additional question about the future for distillers grains with a look towards the production of cellulosic ethanol. Now, with this week's weather outlook, here's Nebraska Extension Associate State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we go for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, we dealt with that large upper air low in the southwestern United States that slowly migrated its way up into the northern plains. Of course, on the first couple days of precipitation last weekend, we've seen the rainfall moving essentially from a southward position to a northward position, basically in front of this upper air low that was parked over northern portions of New Mexico, southern Colorado. That brought a series of thunderstorms complexes that developed in the high plains region, moved northward. And on the backside, of course, we've seen snow, and we had seen some significant snow in the foothills of the Rockies and to the west of Denver. Totals ranging anywhere from 12 inches to upwards of 4 feet, depending on location, of very wet, sloppy snow. In Nebraska, of course, in the southwestern part of the state, we had anywhere from 3 to 6 inches common totals, basically west of Hastings. There was an isolated 2 report of 8-inch plus totals. They're unofficial yet, so we're not going to name those names. And then, of course, as we went to the south, we've seen a significant amount of precipitation in northern Texas, Oklahoma, and in the Houston area, where some locations received over 20 inches of rainfall with this storm system. Then as that upper air low started to kick out, the surface low basically fell apart as it moved up into the northern plains. That upper air low, of course, moved out during the middle part of the week and brought another 1 to 2 inches across the eastern section of the state that missed out on the heavy precipitation. So overall, everybody received a good dosage of rain. In fact, some locations received several months worth of precipitation, and that pretty much put to bed the normal dry conditions that were introduced by the drought monitor several weeks ago for the southwest and south central part of the state. They're still showing southeast and east central in abnormally dry conditions, but remember, this only went through Tuesday, so next week's drought monitor will reflect their most recent precipitation. Now that we've seen a couple days of drying, we do look forward to another system moving into our region and bringing a chance for shower activity, and likely going to further delay some field activity, particularly in the wetter areas of the state. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what's going on. Here's your system that's taking shape over the northern plains. We should see a fairly nice weekend, warm conditions. We may even approach 80 in some locations this weekend, particularly today. And there's a possibility that some of those temperatures will approach the 80-degree mark tomorrow. But this system will start sliding toward the east, and that will increase some chances for precipitation this weekend, although the main activity looks like it's going to be in the Dakotas. If we see any further southward drift of this system, of course, we would bring that precipitation shield into northern Nebraska. But overall, we're only looking at 1/10 to 1/4 of an inch at most, and that's if you happen to be under one of these showers. As we get into tomorrow, the system starts to roll toward the western Great Lakes, bringing precipitation to our north, and we'll see the clouds increase across a majority of the state, with any precipitation that falls primarily across the northern 1/3 of the state. Now, as we go into Monday, we see that system weaken as it goes toward the Great Lakes, and we look to our attention to another upper air low that is going to start moving its way into the central Rockies, and this may generate some thunderstorm activity across northern Nebraska on Monday. And then as we get into Tuesday, we'll start to see the system approach, so we get another deep fetch of moisture into our region, and we are looking at some fairly organized precipitation breaking out in western Nebraska and then moving eastward as the day progresses. And by the time we get into Wednesday, we'll start to see that moving to the east of Nebraska, bringing an end to the precipitation probably around the noon hour. And then we'll start to see a drying trend, at least temporarily, as we get into Thursday in advance of another upper air low that looks like it's going to push out. And this one looks like it may bring some severe weather as we get into next week. And so by the time we get to Friday, this system is starting to approach the southern Rockies, deep fetch of moisture, all the classical signs of a severe weather outbreak possible as we get into next weekend, with heavy precipitation likely. Now, as we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, we take the warmer conditions to our east, and we're looking at the cool conditions associated with this big upper air low that's going to be pushing out next weekend. And in terms of precipitation, a wide expanse of above normal moisture across the entire United States, with the heaviest precipitation for the southern and central plains, touching up into southeastern Nebraska.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, soybean seedling diseases, ag appropriations, and feeding distillers grains. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and Dave Aiken will recap the Nebraska legislative session. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.